is probably a good time for me to do this. Just as I told you, came back from Idaho, and that's where my roots are, and I saw the old farm, or the place where it used to be. It's now developed, but I was kind of reminiscing, and so it's a good time for me to sort of reflect on how I got here and what I'm doing. And I look back on those times with kind of the reflection is, how did I get here where I am? And I had the opportunity to kind of think back and appreciate the education that I had in order to become, to have the opportunity to get educated myself and to do this. So I came here in 1985. I came from a veterinary practice that was a large animal practice. I had been working up in the Northwest. I wasn't really planning to be an academic, but I came here because of a kind of an unusual family situation. Without going into the details, my son had severe allergies, and he was a baby at that time, and they were pretty severe, and I was making it worse because of my work with livestock. I would come home and he would have a bad reaction. And I thought, great, what am I going to do now that I've put all that I had into going through veterinary school if that's not going to work out? And I thought, well, I could do what my advisor did, but then I thought, how many jobs are there really like that? And then lo and behold, this job came open at Fresno State, and I came here possibly thinking that was just a temporary kind of situation, but I came here and loved working with students. I had the opportunity to work in a different way using the veterinary education that I had, and it worked out that it was an opportunity for me to fit. So it's sort of like I didn't really select this as a career, but it kind of found me, and it seemed like it was meant to be. So pretty soon after being here for a few years, I decided, yeah, this is what I want to do, and this became a career rather than just a fix for a situation that was difficult. So I came here in 1985. I was the first kind of full-time veterinarian. There was a couple of veterinarians doing part of the clinical work and part of the teaching, and they decided to consolidate that into a full-time position, and so I did that then. So my assignment was 50% teaching, 50% clinical work to keep things going at the university farm, and that fit me well. Going back to the reason that I came here, on the days that I had animal contact and direct work with the animals and picked up all the hairs and danders that were causing problems, I was able to shower and change clothes and before I went back home, and that worked for my son, and it worked out as an opportunity for us to continue to do, to utilize what I had prepared for, but then also to work in my field. When I was looking for that job, I found this opportunity open in Fresno State, and I thought, oh, this must be an inside job, because it had already closed by the time it was posted in the AVMA Journal. But I called them up, and Dave Daly who was the beef professor here at that time and a great academician, and he later on went up to Chico, and he was the head of the search committee, and he said, no, we're still working on this. We'd love to have you apply. I came here, and I just sort of felt like this was the answer to what we'd been struggling with. And so I came here. The interview went well. I did not at that time have a California veterinary license, and so I had to come here without that and work through that during the first year, which I did, and then I became licensed in California, because I really didn't plan to come to California until this kind of situation arose, and it brought me here, and started in the fall semester of 1985.
And your family situation then, how many kids and ages?
Well, this was our fourth child, and we had our fifth child right after we came here, and so he He started improving with the drier climate. I was up in the Northwest where it was wet, and so he did much better after we came here. My wife was pregnant at the time we moved here, and then the daughter that was born in the first couple of months here in Fresno is now a professor in the Kremen School of Education, and she teaches literacy. And so she's been a Fresno Stater all the way through. I had been to California. I knew of the Central Valley. I used to joke in my infectious disease class that I knew of some diseases that were only found in the foothills around the Central Valley, and I'd say, well, that would be interesting, but I'd probably never see those things. But I'd not really spent much time in California until that time. I had been in California, but I hadn't really spent any time here. Was familiar broadly with the agricultural basis of Fresno. I knew Fresno State from athletics, but I didn't really, and I knew that this was an agricultural center, and I came here knowing just that, and then it seemed at home to me because I had grown up on a farm. My father was a civil engineer, but he always had a farm for us boys to keep us out of trouble. And my brother and I kind of worked that into a little bit larger dairy, and so I was familiar with the industries that are prominent here in the Central Valley, and of course felt like it was a good place for me once we got here. And our family situation turned out to be a great place for us to not just to overcome the medical issue that brought us here in the first place, but it was an opportunity for us to have good schooling. Our kids are all went through the Clovis schools, but went to good universities. They have advanced degrees, and so it was a good place for us to raise our family. So it all seemed to work out, and like I said, it seemed like it was meant to be. I was not to be a large animal practitioner for my entire career. I think I was meant to be an educator. It's interesting that in our family, in my father's family particularly, there are several educators. My father was raised on a dry farm in southeastern Idaho, but he had a mother that read to him a lot. He was one of 7 children. Out of those 7 children who had never really been educated, came from situations where education wasn't really possible, 5 of those 7 children got college degrees. And I think that was really unusual, but because of the desire to learn things as they grew up, because of the influence of reading and other things, and my daughter is now a reading expert, but several in that family are educators, teachers, then school administrators. There's a school named after my uncle in eastern Idaho. So education seemed to be a good fit. I think my dad would have rather been a university professor more than anything else. When he came and visited me here a couple of times, he always wanted to go to the classroom and so on. So I think I must have been born to be an educator. I thought I was supposed to be a large animal practitioner, so I put the two together. I worked mostly with cattle as I was growing up. We had one of those farms when I was a kid that had different species. My first job was to tend the chickens and then the hogs and then the cattle. We actually had beef cattle and dairy cattle, just not that many of each. But I learned to love livestock, particularly cattle. And so that was my interest in veterinary medicine. So as I was working on that as a teenager and so on, the people that I had respect for were the veterinarians that came to do work for us at our small little farm. And I liked them, and I could see that they were adding value and that they were respected. And I thought, you know, I like science, I like medicine, but I think I want to do what they are doing, and I think I could help people in that way. And so there was my interest in veterinary medicine, and it was from, say, early high school on. That was really the only thing that I wanted to do. So I worked hard in college to get the grades that would allow me to do that, and it was hard to get into veterinary school at that time. And then because of my struggles getting into veterinary school, because I could see that it was a difficult road to take, I think that prepared me to help the students that I ended up working with. So in my teaching, the teaching side of my responsibilities here at the university, back well before the time we had an advising center, I spent a lot of time working with students, because there are a lot of students that came here in the animal science department that wanted to go to veterinary school. Many more than I knew could get into veterinary school. And so it was a good challenge to work with them, not only to help them get into veterinary school, but to help them think of an alternative career if that wasn't going to work out for them. And I think that worked pretty well as far as helping students that really didn't have a chance to get into veterinary school to see that they could do something else that had where they could make a good contribution and utilize their education. But I wanted them to continue and make sure that they could get as much education as they could get. Education opens a lot of doors, and I felt I was so appreciative that it had opened some doors to me. I was appreciative that I had selected a career that had broad options. I could have done research, I could have worked in the pharmaceutical industry, I could have worked in a clinical practice, I could work in education. I had a variety of things that I could do with that education, and I tried to help other students see that there's a variety of things they can do, but there's a lot of things you can't do if you don't get your education behind you and get that groundwork behind you. And so I always had that desire to help them find their way and to improve themselves and to do better because they stayed with it. And even if they didn't get into veterinary school, they could succeed. That is a difficult conversation with somebody who all their life said, I really wanted to become a veterinarian. There were a lot of those students that had that desire and hadn't really thought it through. For example, I really want to go to veterinary school, but I'm not really that interested in the science side of things. And I thought, well, you those two things go together. And so then it becomes a discussion of what are your true interests. This is something that you've had sort of a dream, and dreams are good and goals are good and working towards that is good, but being realistic about that, if that isn't really the right fit for you, then you start thinking about, well, I could do some other things that are related to animal science or nutrition or in the animal pharmaceutical industry where people are explaining to producers how to utilize the new products and new vaccines, the new pharmaceuticals that are coming out, and how to use them in their and how to make that a career that's alongside veterinary medicine, but maybe not that. So probably realistically, almost half of the students in animal sciences came to the animal science program, whether they had a farming background or not. They came to the program because they said, I want to go to vet school. Hey, that looks like animal science. So that would be at times about 100 advisees that I would have, and sometimes even more than 100. 100 advisees that were interested in veterinary medicine, thought they were interested in veterinary medicine, or put that down as to what they were doing or whatever. And that's why we needed to have a program or a way to kind of really figure out how serious they were about that degree program. And so the advising load was heavy. The discussions individually about what's your alternative plan and those kinds of things were quite time consuming. Right from the beginning, and we started a class that was an animal science. It wasn't an internship program, but it was a class that was sort of like a preceptor kind of a program where we would introduce and essentially in a way it was just a 1-unit class, but to do kind of group advising and to explain to them what veterinary school was like, because they really sometimes hadn't thought that through, but to also then say, look, here's your goal to go to veterinary school, and maybe that's going to work, but maybe that's not going to work. So early on, be thinking of an alternate plan, because in reality, in the end, you may think you're qualified to go to veterinary school, but you don't get in. That decision may not be completely up to you. So what's your alternative? So think of that through. So in the freshman and sophomore years, I wanted them to be thinking of track A or track B, and many students had to go down their alternate plan. It's a little bit more streamlined now and a little easier on the advising side from the faculty advisor side, because we have the advising center, and they do a great job, and they're very good at finding out what the pre-vet requirements are at UC Davis or at Washington State or at Colorado State or whatever, where a lot of our students go to vet school. My first big challenge was, and I think veterinarians in general are kind of, they're kind of mavericks. They're kind of in that, especially large animal veterinarians. They're kind of, they've selected something where they're out doing their own thing, and they don't have people kind of telling them what to do, I would say. My first challenge coming here was, and I really would seriously think about this and say, how am I going to handle this? But my dilemma was, can I really live in a bureaucracy like this? And I had to kind of swallow that a few times and say, yes, they've got these policies, they've got these reasons for doing things, and I need to try to fit in and not just do things my own way. Fortunately, I was in a program where I could go out to the university farm and do the lab the way I thought it needed to be done, but there were obviously other academic standards and things that I needed to do or to deal with. The department has changed a lot over the years. When I came here, it was relatively small. There were only 5 or 6 tenure track faculty. There were very few part-time faculty or lecturers. Now, there's not a huge number more on the tenure track side, but there are a lot more on the lecturers, and the course offerings have expanded. The interest in animal science is still a lot from the pre-vet program, but the other programs are running very well, and they find out that I could do herd management, or I could do nutrition, or I could do other things related to that, because those offerings are there within the college. So we have a lot of students that are interested in animal science. Sometimes that starts as a pre-vet or a veterinary career kind of goal, but there are still some needs. Actually, I said at the beginning, I just got back from Idaho, and my brother does some work with the legislature up there, and I was speaking with the president of the Farm Bureau and a couple of university people from the state of Idaho and the state of Utah, and at Utah State University they're trying to put together a veterinary school, and I've realized that there is a need, and I've always known this, but it's kind of re-emphasized, that there's a need for livestock specialists for large animal clinicians. So their focus on the veterinary school is for the dairy industry and for the beef industry and for those types of things. And so our students here, there are job opportunities for them, and we need to kind of match the needs of the industry with what we're doing. But I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that. One of the advantages of Fresno State that I appreciated right from the beginning, I went to a university where they had a university farm, but it was about 20 miles away. I noticed immediately when I came here the fact that the farm is connected to the campus, and that was such a great advantage. We could literally teach something in the classroom in the morning and go to a laboratory in the afternoon or even the next hour after teaching a concept, and you could illustrate it or demonstrate it by a procedure at the campus. And I loved that experiential, hands-on kind of opportunity, even if the students weren't really allowed to do, certainly not like a surgical procedure or something, but they were allowed to assist and observe and get a feel for that. And that's something that when I talked to the veterinary schools, I said, this is not a UC school, and the academics may not be exactly the same, but we do a good job with the academics. But in addition to that, you need to realize these students are coming to you with some hands-on experience, and they're ready to go to work. Sometimes I felt like it wasn't appreciated as much as it should be in the application process, because I knew there were students that could do it, and maybe academically they were a couple of notches behind some of these other students that they're competing with, because it's very competitive. But that was certainly an advantage. I would get feedback from students that would say, we did things in the laboratory here that helped me in veterinary school. Back in the day when I was still doing a lot of the clinical work, it was good for students to see a simple procedure, to ultrasound a pregnant mare, to do some surgical procedures on animals, to see how that worked, to see what it was like to do a surgery. It was almost like an abdominal surgery to do what's called a displaced abomasum in dairy cattle to repair those things. Now they couldn't do every step of those things, but they could observe and they could learn. There's something to be learned about what it takes that you can actually in the field give a general anesthetic to a horse and do a procedure, and they were able to see those kinds of things, and they would either become more or less interested in seeing that this was the right step for them, and it was one of those opportunities to help them make the decision. But we're able to do some of those procedures, and again, we're able to do those because we have the university farm next to it. As I changed, I started doing less of those kinds of things as I got into these other areas. But I look back on those times of doing laboratories out there and doing veterinary procedures and as routine as vaccinating and other injections or whatever, to taking a blood sample, to some of those things that the students can do, to demonstrating things. But I look back on those and I think the students appreciated them a lot. We mentioned how important it was to have the university farm right on the campus, and that's been such an advantage. I'm glad with all the pressure that has gone on to make the Save Mart Center, to make some of the other development that's gone on near the Save Mart Center and other things that have happened on campus. I'm glad it's still here. It's reduced in size slightly, but this is a tremendous resource, and it's something that we can say that most universities can't say, that we still have adjacent to our academic programs, we have laboratories, and we can get our feet in the dirt and our hands a little bit dirty, and we can do some things that are practical, and we can work with some things that are real life, and we can solve some real world problems, or we can teach them how you actually teach the students how you actually do those things. So the university farm has decreased in size, but not fairly significantly, but not to the point where it's not an operational unit. We've gone through some some changes in the department in the animal science side of that, may be driven by the industries around us, but there are industries that are really important to us here in California, and one of the most important is the dairy operation. When I came, there was not a poultry unit, but there were many jobs around us here with Foster Farms, and at the time Zaki Farms and so on, where and in other places as well, or smaller units. Now there's Pittman's have a big poultry operation and so on. So there was a demand for students, and we were able to develop that kind of return to that industry. And it's an important industry in California, and we have a growing facility here that's just exactly like what the industry standards are, and so we're able to develop that in the last few years. So we've made some changes in the department. Some things have become a little smaller, but other things are new, and the poultry I think is the best example of that. Industry-driven, things that need to be done because of because California has changed somewhat, but the dairy industry is still strong, the beef industry is still strong, the poultry industry has become much more prolific than it was when I came here in 1985. But we have made, I think, adjusted fairly well to the industry demands. For the first 10 to 12 or so years, that was what I did. I was the clinical veterinarian. I was the university veterinarian. I had some university responsibilities related to animal care and use from that position and so on. Later on, I started changing somewhat with some interests, I guess, that I had, and some encouragement from other people. I started in the first few years, because research was still part of my probationary plan, my academic plan. I did do some research. I worked with a protozoan disease. That was a disease that caused infertility in cattle. And that interest kind of takes me into one of my mentors here at the university, not in our department, but actually the pre-vet advisor for the biology department at the time. His name was Wally Harmon, Dr. Wally Harmon, and he was a protozoologist. The disease that was kind of in front of us that needed some answers for the diagnosis of this disease was a protozoan disease. Dr. Harmon had come to me, I would say, not in an antagonistic way, but not really expecting too much right from day one when I first came here, because he was not that pleased with the previous pre-vet advisors from the animal science department, mainly because they said everybody who goes to vet school needs to go to vet school with an animal science degree. And we sat down and talked right at day one, and that attitude that he'd had about the previous one sort of changed when I said, no, the major that they choose really depends on this alternate plan. If they don't get into veterinary school, which is also the thing that we were talking about before for these students that may not get into vet school. So we then kind of bonded, I guess, and became good friends, and he became sort of a mentor for me through the academic side of things, but also through the research side of things, because he was a great scientist. And he was interested in in a kind of a companion disease to this disease, which was called trichomoniasis, that affected cattle. And we researched some things with that together and worked on a diagnostic tool that became sort of the gold standard for how to diagnose this disease, because you had to find the organism. You couldn't do an antibody test because it was a localized disease, and worked out very well to do that, and also allowed me to have the advantage of having a mentor, a university mentor, a real researcher and an academician, and he had been here for 25 years or so before I came, and so he was sort of my mentor and my research companion through these things, and we taught some things together. We gave seminars together. We did speaking things at other places together because of his expertise in trichomoniasis, and then I could apply it on the clinical side. So that's what we could do, especially with the research back then, is we could do the applied research and how does it actually work in the field. And it was a great opportunity for me to have a mentor to work through that with him. We actually had some of that disease in the range. The range was done a little bit differently now, and we've pretty much given up the range, which is up in the foothills. Going back to the person who was on the committee, or the head of the committee when I was hired, Dr. Dave Daly, said, we got some problems here with this, and what if it is this particular disease, and so that sort of worked with that. So we worked on the diagnosis of this, and Dr. Harmon helped. We worked with somebody else that had a new diagnostic medium to grow the organisms, and then we applied it first here in the Fresno State herd and found that it worked, and pretty soon cattlemen in the area were trying to figure out, some large animal veterinarians in the area were trying to find a more accurate way to diagnose the disease, because it was difficult to grow, and to get a culture started from this organism. And so I think we ended up helping the California cattlemen. It's mostly a beef cattle disease, and also had the benefit of things working for us here on campus, and we're able to get the disease under control. It's not changed since then. You still have to grow the organism. The pouch that we were using to grow the organism is still being used by large animal vets today. So that's a long time ago, and it still works pretty well.
Is there a name on the patent that has a...
It was called in pouch, which is meaning it was a sort of a self-contained liquid medium where you would take a sample and put it into this bag and then put it into the incubator, and it was convenient, especially for field use, because everything you're doing is field use. You have to take the samples in the field, and you can essentially get them growing as soon as you put them in a warm place. That could be in your pocket as you're doing the rest of the herd or whatever. You can you're basically starting the incubation process as soon as it's in the pouch. By the year 1998, 1999, 2000, I was starting to do some other things as well, and it was not because I didn't like doing what I was doing. I guess I just had other broader interests as well, and partially because of another mentor. Dr. Gary Weiniger was the director of a program called the Solutions Center, which intrigued me because it was like an internship, but it was a group project, and it was taking a professor on whatever area of campus. It was a university-wide program by the time it started in the College of Agriculture, but it was a university program by the time I worked with Dr. Weiniger on this, and it was a program to give students from whatever discipline, hands-on experience. And so as the director, I was kind of like an associate director with Dr. Weiniger, and our responsibility was to find a problem in industry or some of the agencies or industries around in Fresno. Some of those were ag-related, some of them were different agencies or programs, even Caltrans and different things, where they had a problem that they couldn't solve with their existing team, or perhaps didn't have the focus or the time to do it, where we could come in with the expertise and say, we could solve this problem for you. In other words, we would find a professor, a scientist, an expert on campus to say, oh yeah, I could help them solve this problem, as if it were a consulting group kind of situation. And then we would work with that professor and say, on the kind of the way to work it into your schedule, would say this could count for one of your 4 classes that you're teaching, but your class size would be just made up of 4 or 5 students. So that professor and working with us would come together and decide on a team, probably in most cases an interdisciplinary team. So let's say this is a manufacturing project like at Grunfos Pumps, where we did several projects where there's a repetitive motion injury that they need to make some adjustments in order to prevent some difficulties with the people that are doing this all day. And the team would include engineers, somebody from engineering, somebody from physical therapy, somebody from industrial safety, somebody with more of the business part of that. And so you'd have 4 or 5 students, maybe from 2 or 3 or 4 different disciplines, working together to solve the problem. So with the professor, we would say, okay, you know how to, so let's say that professor in that example is an engineer. You say, you know how to solve this problem. Now, don't solve it, but let the students solve it, let them figure out how to do it. And so students were working together in an interdisciplinary team, as they would be in the real workplace, finding an answer that they think is unique, and it probably is in many cases, saying this is the best recommendation. So they would work on this problem with certain benchmarks along the way in order to get towards that answer and give an interim report and a final report and a written report and so on to the sponsoring company. So it would cost the company enough that we could backfill the release time for the professor and keep the center going, but it was a good bargain for the industry to find an answer, and then the students could see what it was like to work with an interdisciplinary team in kind of a real world. So these are senior students, junior students in some cases, occasionally a graduate student, but students that had some experience, and interestingly then, some of those students would get job offers from the people that they say, well, you know, because they can watch them work together as a team and see how they're doing things, because they would be watching some of the progress in the meetings and the project as it works its way through, and they kind of would say, I kind of like this one. I think we're going to hire, or these two. I think we got a place for them. So that was kind of better than an internship in some ways, because it made them problem solvers, and it also made them work together as a team. And so you can see some things when students are working together as a team, to see how they work together, to see how they problem solve together. And so I started working with that, and that was a quarter-time release for a while. It was a half-time release for a while, and when Gary retired, I became the director of the Solution Center so that was a full-time assignment for a while. Then I came back to the Department of Animal Science and was doing my pre-vet things again. And then a few years after that, I kind of had a different kind of pull-away assignment, as the dean, who was Dan Bartel at that time, asked me to work with the California Agricultural Leadership Foundation, which is another opportunity or kind of a potential release time assignment that's very different. So this, instead of being teaching science, was teaching leadership. And I'd had some experience in leadership, but I was no expert, but I became more adept at some of the leadership skills that are needed in the, with some training that we did. But the Ag Leadership Program has been going for 55 years now, and it is a statewide program. It's its own program. It's run by private funds supported by the ag industry. So people make donations to this program. Some industries make donations to this program. So it's a self-sufficient program. It's a statewide program, but it's a cooperative program with the 4 ag schools in California: Cal Poly, Pomona, UC Davis, and Fresno State. Chico has always kind of wanted to be in that, and they are partially involved in that. But the 4 ag schools have been working together for well over 50 years on this program, and each campus had a core faculty member, and that was my assignment as we started doing that. And somewhat like the Solution Center, pretty soon I was doing a little bit more than the other 3 faculty members. Their director of education moved on, and they needed a director of education, so I was asked to be the director of education after being a core faculty member for a period of time. And I did that for, well, I was a core faculty member for 7 years or so. That was a part-time assignment. I still taught some of my classes. I was kind of pulling a little bit away from doing some of the clinical work. Then for about the last 7 years of that, because I worked with them for about 14 years, for the last 7 years of that, I was the director of education, which was really a full-time position. So they were buying out my time from the funds they had, and so I was kind of gone from campus for that period of time, and we had to have other people come in to do the clinical work, other people to teach the courses and advise the students and those types of things. But I did that for a number of years. The other thing with that program that is completely different than what I'd been doing before is that these were mid-career adults. So they were in their 30s and 40s, and that sounds like, okay, that's a little different, but it's a completely different sort of educational process when you're working with adults that have had life experience. They're selected for a program because they were seen as emerging leaders, and they were chosen because we need leaders in agriculture to maintain the viability of agriculture in California. So especially in California, and this is a program that's in several other states, at least a dozen or 15 or more other states have similar programs. The California Ag Leadership Program has been going continuously longer than any of them, but the situation is, if we don't have people in ag that are involved in policy and have the know-how to understand the political landscape so that the people who are making decisions have are not saying, well, we don't need water for agriculture, or it's okay if we take more land away from agriculture because we can grow these crops in Mexico or whatever. The viability of agriculture in California especially requires people that understand how to manipulate. Maybe that was a Freudian slip, and maybe that's what I meant to say, but how to maneuver through the regulatory environment, to understand the policy decisions that are going on in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C. So this was a program where you would have seminars, and you would teach leadership skills and public speaking skills, and you would teach them how things work in Sacramento, and you would go to Sacramento, and because the program had been going on so long, you had great access because people who had gone through the program were now in Sacramento, or people in the in Washington DC, like George Radonovich, who was a member of the U.S. House of in Congress, as was a graduate of this program, and Devin Nunes, who was involved in some of these things, was a graduate of these programs, and these people would give us access to people in Washington. So we would get a real good inside look at what's going on there. Or George Radonovich was also good friends with Justice Scalia, who was on the Supreme Court, and so we'd have our own session, which is an unusual kind of thing, with 25. Each class was 24 individuals. We'd have our own session of a couple hours with Justice Scalia or with a congressperson or a senator or whatever, because of the contacts that we had there. All of this was to teach leadership skills so that we could maintain agriculture and maintain an environment that allowed us to have policies that where regulations are not so onerous, because these are problems that we're dealing with all the time, or water use policies or whatever, so that we can continue to do agriculture in California. This is the best place to grow some of the crops that we grow. So we need to be able to continue to do that. And some people in Washington don't actually understand that, and they don't really know where their food comes from. And so that was a program. So I did that for several years, and that sort of all of a sudden took me away from the academic environment of being right on the campus, but it was a different experience, an interesting experience. We would do these seminars. We would also travel together. One of the responsibilities of the director of education was to set up a unique travel experience internationally in developing countries for these students, because there are some things you can, I said students, they're fellows within a male or female, but it's a program of these emerging leaders. But there are some things you can teach differently or better, or maybe some things you can't teach otherwise, unless you completely get them out of their environment. So if you're in the middle of the bush in Southern Africa or Eastern Africa or wherever, there's some leadership skills you can teach. There's some concepts that you can teach, and you can help them realize that the way we do things in America doesn't mean they're always the right way. And so we have this tendency to go in and say, well, you're not doing this right. But instead, you go in, hopefully, you prepare them, and you say, why do you do things the way you do them? And that could be an agricultural issue, it could be a political issue, because we only spend part of our trips doing agricultural things. We would find out why they do things the way they do politically and geopolitically and whatever in their country. And if you set aside the attitude that we're America, we must be doing it right. If you just set that aside and you say, why do you do this? Why are your policies such that you can do this and not that? And why do you do these things in a certain way? You find out there's a really good reason, because of where they are, that they're doing things the way they are. We also would realize very quickly that as far as monetary things or physical things, these people had very little. And our fellows in the program would always say, well, they don't have anything, but they seem so happy. Well, there's some principles of leadership and just humanity that are in that question that help you realize, and you walk away and you say, is my life and my happiness and my goals and all that, are they really because of material things, or are they from some other things that could have to do with family and relationships and other things that are really more important? So now we've kind of come a full circle about education. Education gives you an opportunity to do things you couldn't do otherwise. I have a favorite saying about education that I heard from a prominent leader and a surgeon who says that education allows you to do the things that other people wish they could do. In other words, somebody may wish they could do a veterinary procedure to save their animal, but only those who have been educated and trained properly can actually help and do that. And so then you take that as what you're trying to teach undergraduate students to say, in order to pave a way for your future, in order to give you the opportunity to do things that you want to do, that you want, if you really want to help people, you can only do that if you're trained to help them. And so the same kind of thing with the Ag Leadership Program. There are things that we learn that are beyond what are just right around us by doing leadership, by doing an international experience and seeing how people are doing different things that allow us to say, maybe I need to rethink this and do it a little differently. And by doing that and setting aside my preconceived ideas, I may be able to help people better because I understand their situation better. So there's a lot to this, and I look back on this as doing this variety of things for 40 years now. I look back and say, you know, I've learned a lot through this journey. I've learned a lot about myself. I was able to learn some things about myself in the Ag Leadership Program by helping them develop some skills. But in order to do some of these things, you have to set aside your preconceived notions, and you have to allow it, you have to have an open mind. And an open mind means, I think I know a lot of things, but for them to realize, I really don't know that much and I don't know everything. And so I need to look at this as a learning experience rather than going in and telling them how to do things all the time. I came back in about, yes, I think it was 2018. So I'm finishing up, I've been doing Director of Education for the Ag Leadership Program. I've been away from campus. In fact, some people forgot I was even on campus, perhaps. I think that's actually likely so. And Dr. Whitty was the dean at that time, great dean. She did a lot of good, and she had an associate dean leave, and we didn't really have time to go through the full search process, but she needed somebody to assist her with the academic side of running the Jordan College of Ag. And so she asked me to consider being the dean, and then went through the approval, the associate dean, and went through the kind of the processes that she needed to do to get that approved. I wasn't really selected by a selection process. And interestingly, I hadn't really taken I had been doing the Ag Leadership Program, but I hadn't done campus leadership roles. I'd never been a department chair. And I said, Sandy, you really want me to be the associate dean if I've never been a department chair and never been on the curriculum committee or, those kinds of things? And she says, no, I think this would work out. And so I was given an opportunity, and I had a learning curve, a steep learning curve there for a bit about how to do some of the things on the university that I'd always tried to avoid. But that turned out to be a really good experience, at least for me. And then she retired, and we convinced Dr. Dennis Neff to come back to the College of Ag. He had been associate dean, and then he had been the dean of undergraduate studies and the dean of students, and was an associate provost at the time. And so I served with Dr. Whitty for a couple of years and with Dr. Neff for a couple of years. That was with Dr. Neff, that was during the COVID shutdown, and so we had some interesting challenges. But again, mentors that helped me hopefully we did some good as we worked together in those roles together. The associate dean brought a different set of challenges, mostly learning policies that I had tried to ignore. And then the challenge there is you do work with students in a different way, but you're also working with faculty and trying to help them find answers to policy issues, or to help them do what they wanted to, what they felt like they needed to do to have their academic successes that they needed to and accomplish the things that they needed to help resolve issues. You find out there are issues, and I'd seen them in my own department, but I hadn't seen how, what kind of issues there were in other departments. But the that was probably, if there was some success there, it was probably based on the leadership training that I had had, because as core faculty members in the Ag Leadership Program, we were trained. We were trained in leadership development. We were trained in personality profiles. We were, so I learned some things that helped me perhaps work better with other people than I could have otherwise. So as an associate dean, I had the opportunity to work with people that I had maybe known a little bit around campus, but had a great relationship with other associate deans from across the campus. And I hadn't really reached out that much across campus. I gave the example of biology, and that was kind of that was sort of familiar territory to me, but to get into some of the other colleges, I wasn't that familiar with the faculty or the way they did things or whatever, but had some great colleagues as associate deans as we would work on academic issues together. There's a few people that have been around as long as I have, but not too many. But one of my friends, and in a different department, but within the College of Ag, was Dennis Neff, and we had quite a bit in common. Our background included some similar universities and so on, and he was an ag economist. But we worked on projects together where there was an economic effect by animal disease or animal products and so on. And so I always liked working with Dennis. Now, Dennis took a very different track than I did, because he was a department chair after, soon after he got tenure, and then he became the associate dean. And I loved him in the dean's office, because he was always a colleague and always a person you could talk to, but also a person with integrity that you knew if you were working with him, you would get what you wanted. So he was a person that I looked up to, and I never thought we'd have the chance to work together as we did. But then for those couple of years, he was the dean and I was the associate dean, and that was a great time. That was as everybody experienced it, that was an interesting time when all of a sudden we weren't meeting with our students, and we were in the middle of a semester, and we weren't able to hold class in person. So we worked on some things together. He was good with the technology things, and we made sure that all our faculty were able to do some of the technology things, to have a Zoom class rather than an in-person class and those types of things. But we also worked out a plan that we were communicating with faculty to send them out messages, to give them ideas, but to send out messages and say, sometimes things like this happen, and you just deal with it. Or they closed down some universities 100 years ago during the Spanish flu, and just say, hopefully to get out the message that this wasn't, don't despair. We're just going to work through it. So he was great at working with, to communicate, to make sure that the faculty were not getting discouraged and so on. But just a leader with high integrity, and you could always hold him and knew that if he gave you his word, that's all you needed. That was Dennis Neff. He was great. So that was a great way to finish my time as a full-time employee of the campus. So I retired from that after a couple of years with Dr. Neff. He stayed on another year. And then I went back to the classroom on a half-time basis, as we can do as the old-time faculty that have been around long enough. We can go back and teach. And so it made more sense, rather than trying to pick up the science classes again, it made more sense for me to teach the Animals in Society class. And so I've been teaching two classes for that for the last 5 years. One of the things during my career that was different on the academic side and the teaching side, that was different than teaching science, was, and this goes back a ways before I started doing things with the Solution Center and the Ag Leadership Program, but in about 1998, 1999, was working with Dr. Neff, who was the Associate Dean at that time, on a general education class in the Department of Animal Science. So I came up with the idea that we could teach animal ethics, but also appropriate animal use and different uses for animals, such as using animals as therapists or co-therapists, but a therapeutic use of animals in such situations, like a good example of this is therapeutic riding. So you take a child with cerebral palsy, or you take somebody who's been injured and they need to strengthen the muscles in their torso. They can actually learn to walk by riding a horse, or they just need the emotional lift, or they're on the spectrum with autism or something like that, and this is an opportunity for them to have something that helps them and puts them on top of the world, and they're mobile and they're able to do some things. Anyway, this course was called Animals in Society. So that course has been taught for 25 years now as a general education course. At that time, going back to before 2000, we were looking for a course when enrollments across the college weren't as robust as they needed to be. We were looking for something that could bring in some teaching opportunities for us in the college, and this was general education area E. It kind of fit this category of lifelong learning, and we were able to make that as a part of the general education program. Very different than teaching a science class, because it's about issues, it's about concepts, and it's also about making the student look beyond themselves and say, yeah, I guess I've got it pretty good, because if I go help this kid ride a horse, I realize that I have a lot of things going for me. And it also helps me realize that looking beyond myself, I can see that I'm not so self-centered, and I can be of assistance, and there is growth opportunities for me in a different way. And so this became not only a general education course, but one of those that fit the service learning concept that fits in with the Service Learning Center. I guess one of the big challenges was in about 2000 was to actually convince other people across campus that this fit the general education requirements, in order for something to work out, to fill those requirements, to meet standards, to have writing requirements met, and those kinds of things. And they challenged me, and they said, we don't think you fit in this area, and I had to try to explain to them why we did. And so we were able to work that through, but it was a challenge. It was a good learning opportunity. I think I can look back on Animals in Society and say we exposed students from across campus. They weren't all animal science students. Maybe in most cases, maybe they were about half animal science students or from the College of Ag. But the rest of them were from whatever major you can think of across campus. students who had a bit of an interest in animals and wanted to learn about companionship and the human-animal bond, as well as maybe they didn't know anything about therapeutic use of animals, but they learned that. And then, but I look back on that and I say, I think they learned some life lessons. I think they learned some life skills. I think they learned some things about themselves. And I think they learned that if they were actually helping somebody, they were happy. And so that was the service learning part of this. But it was a challenge to get to that point. So we never really complete our education. We should be learning every day. I'm working with my daughter. I mentioned that she's a professor in the Kremen School, working right now with her as I'm winding down things here. And my wife is working with her as well, and she's a clinical therapist, working with helping parents solve problems by reading books. And that sounds kind of simple, but sometimes parents don't know what to do, and they can kind of, while dealing with a problem with a child, they can perhaps teach them about how to problem solve and deal with an emotion or deal with a tendency that they have by seeing themselves in a character in a book, rather than telling them what to do, but to not, I guess it's a little bit of like the solution center as well, where the parent should allow them to solve the problem without just lecturing them or telling them how to do it. But let's just read this book and let's figure out what that character, so what do you think that character was feeling at that time? And those types of things, which is a way to get to an answer, or not to an answer. It's a way for a person to develop their own answer because of your influence. So if we look at the core of education, we're here not to tell them, fill their mind just with facts. We're not here to tell them what to do, just like I, as a parent, didn't have much success when I said, you will do this. Rather, I have an effect when I influence them by my example, by offering some alternative plans to a student that didn't know what their alternative plan would be, or whatever. But all these things kind of come together in a way where I look back on this and I say, I think I've had an opportunity to influence other people. Students, emerging leaders, maybe some other professors. So I hope that that influence is something that's a positive influence. And I've appreciated the education that got me here, the opportunity that came in a difficult time in our family. I appreciate the opportunity that I've had to do these things, hopefully to bring some good to other people by influence. It's not all just teaching, it's influencing them and allowing them then to make the decision, whether that's a child reading a storybook or a student figuring out if they can make it into veterinary school or do something else, or if it's an emerging leader in the Ag Leadership Program. Perhaps there are some things that people learn just by expanding. A book can be expanding. A course can be expanding. It opens new horizons and opportunities if we do that. So that's the value of education. I think the reason that I was able to kind of stay motivated, to want to keep teaching, to want to be in the classroom, I think the motivator for doing what I've done for the last 40 years is the occasional maybe sometimes they don't happen that often, but the occasional payday that comes when a student comes back and says, you know, vet school was hard, but I made it, and I got it started right here. Or we talked a little bit about influence. If I think back to the very first semester I was here in 1985, I had a student come to me, and I still remember this very clearly, come to me asking for a letter of recommendation to get into a summer program that would help her get more prepared to go to veterinary school. And she was the first in her family to attend a university, and she didn't have much of that kind of support system from home and so on. She asked me for a letter of recommendation, and I wrote her a letter of recommendation, and she got into that program. But she came back to me because it was the type of letter where she could also look at exactly what was said. And she came back to me and she said, she was starting to tear up, and she said, nobody has ever told me these kinds of things about me. And I didn't even really stop and think that I had some of these skills that you mentioned here. Then if I think back to just a few months ago, I was sitting in a kind of a forum in one of the leadership classes that's taught in the Department of Animal Sciences, and I walked into that room having not really knowing the students that were there, but one looked familiar to me, and she asked a lot of questions, and she was right on top of things, and she was bright, and she was doing things, but I couldn't quite put it together. Maybe it was because the time she was in my class, it was the COVID time, and we weren't really connected in the same way. But I knew I recognized her because I had had individual meetings with her as I thought back. But she came up to me and she says, "You know who I am?" And I hate that question if I'm still struggling, because in my old man brain or whatever. And I said, "You're going to have to help me." And then she started to explain to me that she had a horrible semester in her freshman class, but she was taking this Animals in Society class. And she came and talked to me at the end, and she says, "I'm failing. And I'm failing in my other classes." And she was dealing with some really difficult personal issues, which I don't know exactly what they are, but they were abusive. And I said, "We can work this out." And we did. I can't help you with your other classes, but we can work this out. And I said, "If you're willing to do this and this and this," because there wasn't that much of the semester left. She said, "You help me get a grade in this class. You also wrote a letter," and I said, "Oh yeah, I did do that too. You also wrote a letter to help me get off of academic probation." And now she was flourishing. And she was bright and happy, and she'd worked through her personal issues and so on, and she had a goal to get a master's degree and all these things. My point in telling you those two stories is one of influence, but it's also the motivator, because occasionally as professors we have a payday where you can see that you've actually done something that helped a student. And not just helped them for that day or that week or that semester, but maybe you made a change that helped them for their life. And maybe that's the case maybe in both of these examples, where they realized they had some value and they had some potential, and they could do something if they just stayed on this track. So whether it's a storybook or a college course or a college degree or an advanced degree or whatever, education takes us to a place that we couldn't have gotten otherwise. I realize that I've had an opportunity to influence other people. I hope that's been good, but just like reading a storybook or experiencing something in another country or helping people to open their mind and say, if you're just a little more open-minded about this, maybe you can find a better answer rather than prescribing the answer that you think is the only answer. This is what education is. This is what teaching is. And teaching is more than just facts, but hopefully it's opening a mind. It's lighting a fire rather than just filling a bucket. And so, as I look back on this, I would hope that I've influenced some other people for good. I'm still interested in education. I think education is a lifelong process. I am interested, right now I'm really interested in helping parents help fill the gap between what we got behind on during COVID as far as reading is concerned. And that's my daughter's project, and I'm just kind of a sidecar to that experience. But I'm interested in that because I can see that education is something that opens the door for people in ways that they didn't. I mean, reading a book can open a door that has that just introduces you to something that you've never thought of before, and education is the same way. So I'm interested in continuing to help people in my family, my children, my grandchildren, to continue to really try to realize who they are and the potential that they have. And also, I hope that carried over into things that I've done over the years, and that somewhere along the way somebody may think back and say, yeah, that did help me, and that type of thing. So my interest in moving forward is to spend time with my grandchildren, to help them realize their potential, to hopefully reach out and help parents realize that they can have an influence on preparing their children for a better life because they've opened some doors through education, and become, hopefully then they can leave, like a friend, they can leave somebody else better off than they were before. One of the things about veterinary medicine is you learn and you get some satisfaction by doing things with your hands. Now, I was never like an artist. I was never really a craftsman. But when I stopped doing things with my hands, and maybe there's some of my heritage in this because my grandfather was an artist and a leather worker and a saddle maker, and he made beautiful work in leather. Way back in the early 1900s, he has a saddle that was the first place saddle in the World's Fair of that year, whatever it was. My dad never had any of those artistic skills, and I thought I never had any of them either. But my point was, I got used to doing things with my hands and liking to see that rather than just sitting at a desk all day, that I'd actually accomplished something by looking at something. So I started working with and I'd never even had wood shop, that kind of things, but I started working in my garage just making wood boxes for the grandchildren, or I recently completed a replica of an old roll top desk that's 80 years old, that's in my in-laws' house, that has a real interesting story to it. So I made a replica of that, and I'm just finishing that up, but just to do something with my hands. So I guess my hobby is woodworking. The people that work, that do woodworking say, without the wood, it's just work. So I think I'm trying to figure out if I can do something that maybe somebody would like, whether it's a box or a tool tote, or a cabinet, or whatever. That's my hobby. I like to go hiking and those kinds of things as I'm getting older, and that's not as robust as it used to be. But I think woodworking is going to be where where I spend some time. I really haven't mentioned any large animals or pets because going way back to when my son had allergies, we sort of got rid of all of those. And so I was always talking about that in third person because I never really had them at home because of our family situation. And I've never been in a place, I didn't grow up around horses, but I spent about half of my career working with horses. And so I think if I were to do things with horses now, it would be doing something to help with therapeutic riding.
There are some places around here.
There are some places around here, and our students are very well known there.
Yeah.
I always thought when I started out that I wanted my legacy to be the pre-vet program was more recognized as a solid program that would be, say, oh, if they're applying from Fresno State to UC Davis or Washington State or whatever, that they would say, yeah, this is a program, if they've done this program, they're able to, they're going to be able to handle vet school. I would hope that I accomplished that to some degree, and there's still some kind of a legacy of that. We've had a lot of students go to veterinary school from here. I mean, there's not a lot of spots that are open for those students. I think as I did other things with the Solution Center, with the Ag Leadership, I think I would want my legacy to be, here is a person who well, let me put it this way. Many, many years ago, I heard a definition of a friend. And a friend is a person who accepts you as you are, but leaves you better than you were. And so as I look back on kind of more of a holistic view of academia and mentorship and life learning, learning about life and life lessons and those types of things, I would hope that people would look at any experience, if they were thinking back with some time with me, that they would say, well, I wasn't, I perhaps wasn't as the best student that as good a student as I should have been, but he worked with me, he helped me, encouraged me, and I'm a better person because of that, or I reached a goal that I wouldn't have otherwise met. If there's just a few of those along the way, then it's all worth it.